Welcome to another episode of Mastering Cybersecurity, developed by baremetalcyber.com. Let's dive in. Cross-site request forgery is often misunderstood because the browser may be doing exactly what it was designed to do while still producing an unsafe result. The central problem is not that the attacker necessarily steals the user's password or breaks into the application directly. Instead, the attacker causes a browser that is already logged in to send a request the user did not intend to make. The trusted application may accept that request because it arrives with the same session cookie or other authentication information the browser normally sends. That creates an important security question. How can an application distinguish a request intentionally made by the user from one that was triggered by an unrelated site? By the end of this episode, you should be able to explain why the attack works, what conditions make it possible, and how several defensive controls work together to reduce the risk. Cross-site request forgery, or CSRF, is an attack that abuses the relationship among a user, a browser, and a trusted application. The user has an authenticated session, which means the application has already recognized the user, and the browser holds information that keeps that session active. A malicious or untrusted page then causes the browser to send a request to the trusted application. The main distinction to remember is that the forged request may carry valid authentication even though the user did not knowingly authorize the action. The application sees a recognized session, but recognition of the session is not the same as proof of intent. The attack is called cross-site because one site influences a request sent to another site. It is called request forgery because the request appears to come through the user's legitimate browser session while misrepresenting what the user actually chose to do. The browser's automatic handling of cookies is one reason CSRF can succeed. After a user signs in, an application commonly stores a session identifier in a cookie. For later requests to the same application, the browser may attach that cookie automatically, allowing the user to continue working without entering credentials again for every action. That behavior is useful, but it also means authentication data can accompany a request even when the request was initiated outside the application's own pages. The attacker does not need to know the cookie's value for the browser to send it. The attacker only needs a way to cause the browser to make a request that matches an action accepted by the trusted application. The vulnerability, therefore, comes from relying on automatically attached credentials without also verifying that the request originated from an authorized interaction within the application.
The trusted application may accept the forged request because authentication answers only one part of the security question. Authentication tells the application which account is associated with the session. It does not automatically prove that the account holder deliberately selected the requested action. If the application treats possession of a valid session cookie as sufficient evidence for every change, then a request triggered elsewhere may look almost identical to a legitimate request. This is especially important for actions that alter data, change settings, approve transactions, add accounts, update contact information, or perform other state-changing operations. The application needs some evidence tied to the intended interaction, not merely evidence that the browser is logged in. CSRF defenses, therefore, focus on adding information or conditions that an unrelated site cannot easily reproduce while preserving normal use for the legitimate application.
Several conditions generally have to align before CSRF becomes practical. The user must have an active, authenticated session with the target application, and the browser must be willing to include the relevant credentials with the request. The application must expose an action that can be triggered through a request the attacker can cause the browser to send. The application must also fail to require a value or interaction that proves the request came from its own trusted interface. A forged request cannot produce the same result if the user is not logged in, if the browser withholds the required cookie, or if the application rejects requests that lack valid anti-forgery evidence. The severity also depends on what the targeted account is allowed to do. A request made through an administrative session can have more serious consequences than the same request made through an account with limited permissions. CSRF is related to other web attacks, but it is not the same as cross-site scripting, phishing, or session theft. Cross-site scripting, or XSS, allows untrusted script content to run in a user's browser within the context of a trusted site. CSRF usually does not require the attacker to run script inside the trusted application or read the application's responses. Phishing tries to persuade the user to reveal information or take an action, while CSRF may trigger an action without the user understanding that a request was sent. Session hijacking involves stealing or reusing session information, while CSRF can abuse the browser's existing session without revealing the session cookie to the attacker. These distinctions affect the defense. Output encoding helps address XSS, but it does not by itself prove that a state-changing request was intentionally submitted. The consequences of CSRF depend on the functions the application exposes and the privileges of the authenticated user. A forged request may change an email address, modify a password recovery setting, alter preferences, create or remove data, initiate a transaction, or perform an administrative operation. The attack is most concerning when an application permits consequential changes with little additional verification. Read-only requests are usually less attractive because the attacker often cannot see the returned information under normal cross-origin browser restrictions, although careless application design can create exceptions. Defenders should therefore treat state-changing requests as the primary focus and avoid using simple retrieval requests to perform changes. The essential issue is unauthorized action, not necessarily unauthorized viewing. When a browser carries the user's authority into an unintended request, the application may perform a validly authenticated action that the user did not authorize. Before we continue, this is a brief promotional message. This episode is brought to you by the Bare Metal Cyber Academy. The Academy provides a place for people who want to continue developing practical cybersecurity knowledge through clear, structured education. Topics such as browser trust, application security, and defensive design become easier to apply when the underlying relationships are explained carefully rather than reduced to isolated terms. You can visit baremetalcyber.com to explore the Academy and see the learning opportunities currently available. There are no promises of shortcuts or guaranteed outcomes, only an invitation to keep building useful knowledge in a deliberate way. Now, let's return to how applications can recognize and reject forged requests. Anti-forgery tokens are one of the most direct defenses against CSRF. The application creates a value that is associated with the user's session or with a particular request and places that value in the legitimate page or form. When the browser submits a state-changing request, the application checks whether the expected token is present and valid. An unrelated site may be able to cause a browser to send a request, but it normally cannot read the trusted application's page to obtain the correct token because browser security boundaries restrict cross-origin access. The token therefore adds evidence that the request was generated through the application's own interface. A strong implementation uses unpredictable values, validates them on the server, and rejects missing or incorrect tokens. The token is not a substitute for authentication. It addresses a different question by helping verify the origin and intended flow of the request. Cookie protections provide another important layer, especially the same-site cookie attribute. Same-site controls whether a browser sends a cookie with certain cross-site requests. A setting that restricts cross-site inclusion can prevent the session cookie from accompanying a forged request, which removes the authenticated context the attack depends on. The available behavior varies according to the selected same-site mode and the type of navigation or request involved. Secure and HTTP-only cookie attributes are also valuable, but they solve different problems. Secure limits cookie transmission to encrypted connections, and HTTP-only helps prevent client-side script from reading the cookie. Neither one alone stops a browser from attaching a cookie to every cross-site request. Same-site is therefore especially relevant to CSRF, but applications should not assume it replaces server-side anti-forgery validation in every architecture or browser context. Applications can also examine request context and require stronger confirmation for sensitive actions. Origin and referrer headers may help the server determine whether a request came from an expected site, although implementations must account for legitimate cases in which those headers are absent or altered by privacy controls and intermediaries. Custom request headers can help when an application programming interface, or API, expects requests from trusted client code and rejects simple cross-site submissions. Requiring the user to re-enter a password, complete multi-factor authentication, or MFA, or provide another confirmation before a high-impact change can reduce the consequences of a forged background request. These measures serve different purposes and should be layered thoughtfully. Header checks evaluate request context.
anti-forgery tokens demonstrate participation in an approved interaction. Cookie settings limit credential attachment, and step-up authentication confirms the user again before a particularly sensitive operation.
Defenses can fail when they are implemented inconsistently or treated as optional decoration. Protecting only some state-changing roots leaves the remaining roots available for abuse. Generating a token but never validating it provides no security, and accepting a missing token for convenience defeats the control. A predictable token may be reproduced, while a token stored in a way that an unrelated site can obtain may not provide meaningful proof. Applications also create risk when they perform changes through requests intended only to retrieve information, because those requests are easy for other pages to trigger. Another mistake is assuming that a complex request format automatically prevents forgery without testing what browsers can actually submit across origins. Effective protection requires a consistent server-side policy applied to every relevant action, supported by secure session management and appropriate browser controls rather than dependent on one fragile assumption. CSRF may be difficult to detect from ordinary logs because the requests can come from the user's normal browser, address, and authenticated session. The server may record a valid account and a syntactically correct request, even though the user never intended the action. Detection becomes more useful when applications log the request origin, token validation result, authentication level, affected function, and relevant session details without exposing sensitive values. Repeated token failures, unexpected origin patterns, or sensitive changes that do not match normal application navigation may deserve investigation. User reports can also reveal the problem when account settings or records change unexpectedly. Response should include reviewing the affected action, invalidating exposed sessions when appropriate, correcting the missing control, and determining whether other routes share the same weakness. Logs help with evidence, but preventative design remains more reliable than trying to recognize every forged request after it arrives. A practical review begins by identifying every request that changes server-side data or performs a consequential action. For each one, ask whether the browser automatically supplies credentials and whether the server requires independent evidence that the request came through the trusted application. Confirm that anti-forgery validation occurs on the server and fails closed when the token is missing, invalid, expired, or associated with the wrong session. Review session cookies for an appropriate same-site setting, along with secure and HTTP-only protections, while remembering that each attribute addresses a different risk. Check whether retrieval methods are being misused to make changes, and require additional confirmation for actions with unusually high impact. Finally, test the controls from outside the application's normal origin in an authorized environment. The purpose is not merely to find a token field, but to verify that unintended cross-site requests cannot exercise the user's authenticated authority.
Cross-site request forgery is the abuse of a trusted browser session to send an action the user did not intend. It works when the browser automatically includes authentication information and the application mistakes a recognized session for proof that the user deliberately initiated the request. Anti-forgery tokens help by requiring a valid value available through the trusted interaction, while same-site cookie protections can limit whether session cookies accompany cross-site requests. Origin checks, secure request design, least privilege, and stronger confirmation for sensitive changes add further protection. No single setting should be treated as universal coverage across every application design. The decisive practice is to require evidence of both identity and intent for state-changing operations. An application that verifies those two questions separately is far less likely to accept a forged request simply because it arrived through a browser that was already logged in.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.